What's up guys, and today we've got a video which I think is going to really surprise you. We've got the brand new Huawei Mate 10 Pro, which is the same camera as the Huawei Mate 10, and on paper this phone has possibly the most capable camera we've ever seen on a smartphone. So in this video we're pitching it head to head against the Samsung Galaxy Note 8, considered by many to be the king of Android smartphone cameras. Let's get right into it. Starting off with video, both phones record 4K resolution at 30 frames per second, which is pretty standard for a 2017 flagship. Now because this is such a high resolution, what I've done is cropped into both video files by 1.7 times, so it'll help to highlight the imperfections so you can really tell the difference between the two. The first thing you're probably going to notice is the slight difference in color profiles. Whereas the Note 8 on the right has a slightly more natural look, a look that perhaps slightly more reflects what we're actually seeing with our eyes, the Mate 10 has been a little bit more color corrected. It has a slightly deeper, slightly darker set of colors, which to be honest is not a bad thing. In some scenarios it actually adds an extra layer of definition which the Note 8 lacks, and so in some shots, even though they have the same resolution, the Mate 10 footage can actually look a little bit sharper. One really interesting and quite subtle thing to notice though is that on the surface, whilst the Mate 10 looks sharper, examining a lot of this footage close up, you'll realise the Note 8 is actually preserving a little bit more detail. If we examine the fountains, we can see that in the process of increasing the definition, the Mate 10 has lost a little bit of the texture. And again, when we try the 2x lossless zoom, whilst the Mate 10, if you look from further away, does look like the better image, it's actually the Note 8 which is capturing just a little bit more. If we really zoomed into both of these, the Note 8 would remain clearer for longer. When it comes to image stabilization, the Note 8 has dual optical image stabilization, whereas the Mate 10 only has single. And the Note 8 pulls well ahead every time you take a step, whereas with the Note 8 it's almost difficult to tell. With the Mate 10 it's causing a pretty serious problem. So now we're going to move on to photos, and in this category, at least on paper, the Mate 10 is the far more capable smartphone. Whereas on the Galaxy Note 8, both cameras have a resolution of 12 megapixels, on the Mate 10 we've got one 12 megapixel RGB sensor combined with a 20 megapixel monochrome one. On top of that, in terms of its apertures, the Mate 10 is on a whole new level entirely. We'll get onto that in just a moment. On a bit of a side note, if you are enjoying the video, it would mean so much to me if you could smash that subscribe button. In terms of just straight up raw levels of detail, the Mate 10 does take this fight. In almost every flat photo taken of simple textures, the Mate 10 images will just look a little bit crisper and a little bit sharper, and if you zoom well into them, the Note 8 loses its definition a little bit faster. Now, as we also noticed when it came to video playback, in terms of photos, the Mate 10 just has much deeper colors. And it's not necessarily a good or a bad thing. The Note 8 is definitely a more true-to-life reflection of what we're seeing, but the Mate 10 is not really far off. And at the same time, some people would look at it and think that that image looks better. When it comes to high dynamic range, the Note 8 is a clear winner. Even with the sun streaming into this shot, you can still see that a lot of the grass and the greenery in the background is still well lit too. The Mate 10 is also a little bit less consistent. As you can see here, the gravel probably looks a little bit better on the Mate 10, but in terms of the sky, it has completely destroyed the lighter areas. When it comes to camera aperture, the Mate 10 has a pretty serious advantage here. In fact, it is the first smartphone ever to have f1.6 apertures on both its dual lenses. That compares to an f1.7 and an f2.4 on the Note 8. And this has a couple of useful implications. When you're shooting through your normal camera auto mode, the Mate 10 will get just a little bit more bokeh in the shot. As you can see, when you're focusing on something close, the background is just a tiny bit more blurred out. The wider aperture should also mean the Mate 10 is far better at coping with lower lighting conditions. And it's a bit of a mixed bag when it comes to this, because the first thing you're probably going to notice is that the Mate 10 has far darker photos. What seems to be happening here when you shoot photos in the automatic mode is the Mate 10 is drastically reducing its exposure in order to hide the amount of noise in the shot. Even so, it's quite easy to tell that the Mate 10 is suffering less from this low lighting. Whereas the Note 8 becomes a bit of a blurry mess, the Mate 10 does still retain some level of definition. Now we've got the phone's portrait modes, and it's a bit of a difficult one to compare because they both go about it in a totally different way. The way the Note 8 goes about it uses the phone's telephoto lens and requires you to zoom into your photo. So the phone won't even let you operate this feature unless you zoom all the way in, which makes it a little bit more difficult in some usage scenarios. On top of that, to actually achieve the Note 8's shot, it's a little bit more fiddly. It requires you to be almost exactly 1.2 meters away from the subject, whereas the Mate 10's is pretty much as simple as opening the app, hitting the button and taking the photo. Having said that, when you do get it right, the Note 8 just looks miles better. The bokeh is much more natural, and the edge detection is a world apart. Both of these smartphones also have 8 megapixel front cameras, and whilst the Note 8 one does have a wider aperture, the colours and the contrast that the Mate 10 automatically adds actually leads it to often have a better image. Even with some quite severe backlighting, the Mate 10 just has a little bit more definition, the darks are a little bit darker, the lights are a little bit lighter. But again, as we noticed with the rear cameras, the Mate 10's colour profiles, whilst they look nice from a distance, do result in a little bit of loss of detail. Just take a look behind me at the leaves. Both the Galaxy Note 8 and the Huawei Mate 10 support lossless zoom, and it's tough to say which one does a better job. Both of them zoom in the same amount, and also there's a negligible loss of detail, you really can't tell the difference. Now, as we start to bring this comparison to a conclusion, there are a few miscellaneous points worth mentioning. As you know, both phones have a dual camera, but with the Huawei Mate 10, the secondary camera here is a monochrome sensor. And to be honest, whilst real purists will swear by this feature, whilst they'll say it's completely different to just putting a black and white filter on a colour photo, the average consumer is going to find it very tough to tell the difference. What I think is in most cases a more useful combination is what the Note 8 has. We have a combination of a wide-angle lens as well as a telephoto on. And what this implies is that every time you take a photo, you can change the settings so that the Note 8 actually captures two. One which is far more zoomed in using the telephoto, and one which gets a lot of the scenery around you using the wide angle. And this brings us to the question, which smartphone actually has the better camera? And for the most part, I'm going to say the answer is the Galaxy Note 8. It has more natural colours, a higher level of detail, and a better live focus mode, and when we compare the two phones side by side in terms of their optical image stabilization, the Note 8 is on a whole new playing field. On the flip side, the Mate 10 has some quite significant redeeming characteristics. Its wider aperture means that when it comes to low lighting conditions, which is one of the main problems when it comes to smartphone photography, it actually tackles it quite a bit better. Another thing to think about is that the Note 8 has now been out for a couple of months, and in that time, through updates, has gotten quite a bit better. When the phone originally launched, it wasn't nearly as polished an experience as it is now. Expecting a similar sort of level of improvement with the Mate 10, and they could very well be a little bit more on par given a couple of months' time. And the final thought really to round it all off is don't forget the Mate 10 and the Mate 10 Pro are quite a bit cheaper than the Galaxy Note 8, which can't be found for much cheaper than $1,000. Anyway guys, thanks a lot for watching, and it would mean so much to me if you could subscribe to the channel. With that being said, I'm Mr. Who's the Boss, and I'm signing out.